Yeah, my name is Iryna Zamuruieva. I'm from Kropyvnytsky myself, central Ukraine. I think I have some neighbors here today from other neighboring regions, which is nice. I am based in Scotland in the moment, working on climate and land policies. But today, I'm not going to be talking about that. I'm going to be talking as an independent researcher, an artist, and this talk is going to be a mix of sharing my experience of writing and creating with ecofeminism. And some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are kind of more finalized, and some are just emerging, something that I would like to develop. And I would like to outline first kind of how we see the point of thinking with ecofeminism. And living in a world where the human-induced climate and ecological collapse isn't a mere possibility in a distant future, but a present-day reality flowing through our bodies and streets requires a lot of unmaking, unlearning, and undoing, and even more for regeneration, revitalization, and recreation. And for this, we need the politics and practice that are deeply rooted in understanding of how the existing systems of domination and exploitation, such as colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, have produced the overlapping socio-ecological crisis, war, climate change, gender oppression that we're talking about today, and how these are affecting different species, ecosystems, and entire webs of life. And ecofeminism has an essential role to play in understanding these, in understanding what is to be done, how is to be done, and it offers conceptual tools for engaging with the immense task of dismantling and these overlapping oppressions and building socially and ecologically just futures. And before getting into my own approach to thinking and making with and through ecofeminism in relation to the ecocide in Ukraine, I'd like to position myself in relation to other ecofeminist thinkers. So obviously, gender and environment are enmeshed together in very complicated relations. And the conventional starting point for understanding these relations in Western context, in Western academia, is Françoise Dubon's publication on feminism and death from 1970s, which wove together men's control over women's sexuality and natural resources to explain exploitable through patriarchy. And Françoise coined the term ecofeminism to describe this dynamics. There's different ways to interpret what's the eco in ecofeminism, but I side with those who take it to mean more than human, ecologically aware take on political project of liberation for all, including other species and vibrant webs of life as a whole. And in the Western ecofeminist discourse, we can see its different branches that mirror the splits in the Western theory and practice overall. The essentialist branch that gave the entire movement a better reputation, in my view, by making essentializing claims that women are somehow biologically closer to nature. The liberal branch that seems similar to other liberal feminism and is more concerned with how women are represented in climate or environmental decisions, and a materialist or socialist branch of ecofeminism that focuses on how women and nature are similarly oppressed and exploited through capitalism and patriarchy. And I side personally with the latter, so the materialist and socialist analysis and the view of ecofeminism following the Jennifer Hamilton and Astrid Nemanis as a way to understand gender as inseparable from experiences and discourses of race, sexuality, colonization, ability, age, geography, class, and species. But what I'm particularly interested in is not so much at the moment in ecofeminist thought and theory in the abstract or in thinking how existing theories can be applied in Ukraine, but much more in building the genealogy of Ukrainian ecofeminist thought and praxis that have value in and of itself, that is rooted in Ukrainian literature and cultural imaginaries, and largely for those of us who want to nurture kinship with the people and environments in Ukraine. And I suppose ecofeminism for me is a methodological and epistemological orientation towards justice. And today I'd like to share three strands of my work, both creative and research practice, that have to do with a woman, a plant, and a color. And the first two are more finalized bits of work, but the basis for something I would like to develop in the future. And the third one is more of an emerging piece. And I hope to show how ecofeminism has informed what I look at, what I analyze, and what all of this has to do with ecocide. So the first strand of the story, a woman, Kateryna Gruszewska. I think maybe some of you, hopefully, are familiar with her. She is a Ukrainian ethnographer, sociologist, anthropologist, active in the 1920s. And I first encountered her work when I was preparing a lecture on ecofeminism for a Feminism for Activism school in Ukraine, organized by the Feminist Workshop NGO. And I wanted not only to build lecture on the established Western ecofeminist environmental theories, but also to foreground Ukrainian thinkers. And walking in the footsteps of Oksana Kis, Ukrainian historian and feminist anthropologist, I came across a reference to one of Hrushevska's texts and eventually discovered her article that I have an English name here, but I'm going to read a Ukrainian name because I think it's such a good name and people will hopefully appreciate it. Кілька заважень про засоби жіночої господарчої магії у зв'язку з найстаршими формами жіночого господарства. So, a few remarks on means of women's economic magic in connection to the oldest forms of women's economy. And I'm like, whoa, this is already very intriguing. And when I read it, I thought that she, in my view, this text was a proto-ecofeminist text illustrating the connection between the exploitation of women and nature. And I'm going to give you an example of why understanding her work is essential for understanding the nature of ecocide in Ukraine. And this article that I was just referring to, she begins with questioning the rituals where women perform undressing for various economic or agricultural purposes. So often associated with increasing productivity, such as rituals where women have to roll naked in the field to increase crop yield. And you can tell when she writes about it that she has so much humor and so much wit with which she speaks about it, because she's basically like, wait, what is going on here? Why all of these women are rolling naked in the fields? Who is asking them? Why no one can tell me why is this the case? Why women? Why no men are rolling naked? And she's kind of, there's very good punchy humor there. And from there she unfolds a very serious critique of how historically women have been perceived by men, specifically in relation to land, nature, environments, and how these perceptions eventually translated into images of women as weak damsels in distress, or harmful and malicious and negatively affected women's material conditions of living. And across several articles, Hrushevska looks at how women's labor and ideas about it morphed with agricultural transition. So agricultural transition is her specific focus. And she highlights the process through which class nature of the division of labor leveled women with slaves and rendered their work free, exploitable, and their bodies seemingly inexhaustible. And cheap labor necessary for the large-scale agricultural production, it was, of course, convenient to imagine certain bodies as naturally good at reproductive work. And this is an argument that I think many of you would also recognize, resonates strongly with contemporary ecofeminist thinkers. I'm thinking specifically about Iryna Zamuruieva, who some decades after Kateryna Hrushevska wrote her texts would write about reproductive relations, women's bodies, and nature, drawing attention to the similarities between women's and ecological reproductive work and ways that they are exploited. So what she does so brilliantly is seeing very clearly the bodies that are seen as nature and the bodies that become nature. The bodies are kind of, exploited in that process. And she brings attention to this crux of ecofeminist argument and the wider dynamics at play, which is the marginalization of women in the capitalist patriarchal societies goes together with the marginalization of more than human worlds. And she specifically grounds it in Ukrainian thinking and the context that she has been working with. Hrushevska also invites us to examine how these seemingly ancient beliefs about women's bodies and perceptions of women's work are reflected in our contemporary institutions and worldviews. And this is something that she was inviting her contemporaries to do 100 years ago when she was writing her texts. But of course, this call is still very urgent today. So another example is that you all know the popular image of Ukraine as the breadbasket of Europe. But Ukraine is also the frontier for EU's search for alternative, as an alternative to fossil fuel. When you are on the train in Ukraine, there are many shades of yellow you can see from the window. There's corn, there's soybeans, there's sunflower, there's wheat, and more recently, there's rapeseed. So this is the picture here that I took from the train from my recent trip in Ukraine in May. And these crops that I've just listed, they're exported to the EU as sustainable raw material for biofuel. And what isn't obvious, what you don't really see from the window just looking at these fields, are the intensive agricultural practices that take to produce this, because it's very, very fertilizer intensive. It exhausts the soil. It leaves it, it makes it into something where you can't plant food for eating locally anymore. You don't see the profits and export-driven orientation of land management behind it that is done primarily by large agricultural corporations. You don't see the perpetuated, the resistance efforts that are being suppressed or absent, so resistance by the smallholders, for example. And all this has ripple effects, of course, impacting most severely on those already marginalized. This is something Tamara Marcenyuk has been writing a lot about, and imagined as less than human other species other than white male bodies. And armed with Hrushevska's analysis of the marginalization of women, and in that their access to decision-making and material conditions, we can deepen the understanding of how biofuel hunt under the auspices of action to combat climate change perpetuates the degradation of Ukrainian land, and in that leaves those reliant on it for subsistence in position of even lesser power to influence how this land is managed and cared for. So decades before ecofeminism emerged as a term and as a discipline, Hrushevska researched the relations between women's bodies and their social imaginaries, agriculture, land, and women economic independence. And it's very, very important to notice, I think, because it gives a wider view of ecocide. Of course, the war intensified it, but the harm and the large-scale environmental destruction in the name of, be it economics, export, trade, what have you, have already been taken place. And I think this allows us to kind of broaden the view and ask, basically, when did ecocide begun and what it would really take to stop it. I do have an upcoming article about it, but I can't share it, I think, yet. Talk to me if you want to know more. The second part of my personal rendering of ecofeminism theory in practice to counter ecocide is a plant, which is Adonis vernalis, or Hrycvit Vesnyany in Ukrainian. And there's nothing terribly outstanding about it. It grows, it blossoms, it heals, it poisons, it's eaten, it's pollinated. It creeps northward with the steppes as the climate heats up. And it's also going extinct as its habitat is wrecked, polluted, plowed, and shelled. A day of life in a steppe plant. English, it's known as a pheasant's eye also. And in Ukrainian, its name has twofold meaning. The second part, svit, can mean blossom, but the first part, hore, can mean both mountains or to burn or blaze as its petals glow with hot yellow hues in the spring sunlight. And this one is the story of my relationship with a plant that began with photography and led to collage and text and an essay that Daria was just referring to, where I am trying to connect the work with Adonis vernalis to my Rydny Krai, or to my kin region, Ukrainian steppes, war, and the vegetal dreamings. And since living away from my Rydny Krai, my kin region in Ukraine, I keep wondering if an intimate, loving, caring relationship with a place is possible long distance. If feeling the pain of this violence is possible from afar, this means that the love for distant places must also be possible. Love not in a romanticizing way as mute adoration, but love, as Bell Hooks writes about, one rooted in care, commitment, trust, responsibility, respect, and knowledge, all these being equally valid for people and for places. And practicing this love, what does it mean to study Ukrainian environments now during Russia's imperial war in Ukraine? The question that Daria Tsimbaluk continuously raises and tirelessly keeps finding new answers to. And part of the answer for me is trying to look very closely at one of the smallest scales that I can see with the naked eye, a plant, whose native home is being wrecked and torn just as mine. And our shared home has also been wrecked by exploitative, toxic, and extractivist agricultural practices erasing the steppe. I want to imagine what not only studying, but loving genuinely and fully our collective shared more than human environments means across distances and scales. And what noticing and nurturing collective dreams of living and letting live looks like. A long-distance romance with a place, a love-based case kin study, and attempt to recraft allegiances on the ground. So I don't really have time to go much into detail here, but the ecofeminist orientation and the attention to Adonis vernalis have led me to reassembling the notion of my kin region to be not only about cultural codes, histories, foods, languages, which are of course important, but something was missing. And to be about the particular geological plateaus, the soils, the ways of being and speaking, the fungal and vegetal life worlds, the birds, the insects, and other animals that are part of the web of life of my kin region. All these elements do constitute home for me. And you notice that I say kin region, or the Rydny Krai, a lot, and this is really important for me as I realize writing this essay about Adonis vernalis that in Ukraine there's a way to describe your home place as kin place, as Rydny Krai, and it's very similar but different to the notion of mother, father, homeland, different to the native or ancestral land, and because there is a sense of wider kin to it, Ryd, and there's so much more than blood connection to the kin, and Krai can mean both land and edge and region, and the reason I find it so important to think about Rydny Krai is that if we're really to think with the living beings in places where Russia is waging its colonial war, we must ask what is needed to What is needed for life to defend itself from death? As banal as simple as that. And with Adonis Vernalis, I turned my attention to all the living world around my concrete and brick city, which made me think, all that is also home, much beyond and deeper than a national sentiment would let me think. A nation is less than kin region with all of its webs of life, and this is also what we're defending in this war. And finally, the third strand of the ecofeminist work for me is, it has to do with the color. It is a continuation of the work of the Adonis Vernalis and something I'm building on, branching out in another text. So the work with Adonis Vernalis started very much with the color. When I started making the collages, the ones that I was showing earlier on some slides, I had the color and the name first, żółto-гарячий, the hot yellow, and Marava, the dreamings, and the shape and contents followed. And now I want to think more about the color and following the hot yellow to tell more of the ecofeminist histories. And this is an excerpt from the forthcoming piece that I'm going to read now. The hot yellow hues might make you unsteady if you step into their dazzling history, all things across the warm color spectrum to trip over and assemble our kin regions. There is the gold from Scythian and Sarmatic times, the light beige of wheat and the earthy brown of potatoes, the bright yellow petals of sunflowers, the seeds a woman will try shoveling into Russian occupants' pockets, so that when he dies, they sprout in his place. There is corn in the fields with Ukrainian children, where my grandmother, one of them, hiding from the occupants. The search for the hot yellow continues underground in the Cold War era, with the nuclear race to produce the atomic bomb, launching uranium search expeditions. My kin region ends up being one of them, with the 3 mines to mine for uranium ore for producing heat-emitting element, core part of the nuclear reactor. Can you feel it getting hotter? Keep going forward and back above ground, and we're in 2019 with 1.3 million hectares of Ukrainian land plastered with rapeseed monoplantations, grown primarily to export to sustain EU's quest for alternative fuel. Look under your feet and there is formerly pitch-black Chernozem, turned paler shade of itself, depleted of nutrients, topsoil, weathered dry. And so amidst all this, Adonis Vernalis keeps sprouting. And amidst all of this, I think ecofeminism also obviously invites us to think about the future. And I will read 2 paragraphs to conclude and leave us with a bit more future-oriented thoughts. For me personally, even not being in Ukraine, it is hard to think about the future because the longer the war goes on, the worse it will be after it ends. The reconstruction or rebuilding Ukraine narratives, international engineering firms working hard the lobby corridors to secure the future contracts. Not our future, not my future. Their future looks lucrative. Mine looks bleak. The future is also dying in slow and quiet ways, and the future is the loss of shimmer, vibrancy, and the hot yellow hues going arid. I like to think we can learn so much from our feminist sisters in the Middle East. They too are trying to make sense of the catastrophe that is not looming as a distant future possibility, but right as it unfolds, loops and spirals, not in front of their eyes, but right through their bodies. They know what dealing with the aftermath. Forgot to change the slide there. They know we're dealing with the aftermath of years of war look and feel like. They know about the healing of the wounds that run deep and remain painful to touch for generations. And in our regeneration, I'd like them to be our compass and hopefully we'll be able to offer something useful back. Some places will remain unlivable and some will require tremendous effort to bring back to life. And I keep stumbling over the past trying to think about the future. Writing and saying this, I am under no illusion that after the war things will magically get better. The harm that leaks deeply in our bodies, our underground waters, the toxicity that's spilling itself into our lands, making what is essential, unlivable, dangerous, toxic, hazardous, explosive, lethal, wombs, habitats, floodplains, and the remains of the steppe will pass on the harm that flowed into them against their will. Chronic stress, cancers, lost homes, family members and friends, erased histories. I must have optimism. Something in the back of my mind tries to resist this dark and heavy atmosphere, but the future feels bleak. I drift back to Adonis Vernalis' habitats, some of them destroyed, some poisoned with more heavy metals than any body was ever meant to contain. Will the hot yellow hue fade? The war of attrition's poison gift that keeps on giving more toxic effects, seeping deeper into our tissues, will it fade? I hope we can use ecofeminism to stop the vibrant, shimmering life worlds from fading away. Thank you.